Hi ladies, we just have a few more terms that we need to cover over the course of this first unit. You could think of these as more tools of geography like we talked about earlier in the unit. So I want to spend some time talking about a few of those to help get you ready for the Unit 1 test. One tool that geographers sometimes use is called a population pyramid. And it's what you see on your screen right there. It's a device that shows how populations are distributed by age and gender. So you're seeing female on the right in the blue and males on the left in the red. And this is a population pyramid of Jefferson County from a few years ago. And again, it just shows how many people are alive in each age group in a given population. Now, you'll notice a couple of interesting things if you look at this particular population pyramid. One of those is, if you look near the top, near the older segment of the population, you'll notice that there are noticeably more females than males. And that gets to another stat we're going to talk about later today, which is life expectancy. Women do tend to live a few years longer than men. There's a number of theories about why that may or may not be. But it's one thing you notice when you look at this particular population pyramid. Another thing you'll notice is kind of that wider area in the middle. And that group of people is the generation that we refer to as the baby boomers. This was the group, their parents were the ones who fought in World War II, and many of their fathers were over in Europe fighting the war in between the ages of 18 and 23, 24, right around the time that people of that era might have been thinking about getting married and starting a family in the near future. Well, a whole bunch of people end up putting their lives on hold for a few years, and when they all come back at the end of the war, kind of all at once, they're all a few years behind on their lives, and they end up having a lot of children in a very short amount of time, and that's why we have this large generation known as the baby boomers. But a population pyramid looks like that. It shows you basically how old a given population is, and it also breaks it down by gender. Another statistic that is commonly used by geographers is population density, and that just shows you how many people are crowded into a particular area. The average number of people who live in a measurable area, and we usually measure this in terms of square miles, or if you're using the metric system, you would use square kilometers. But a square mile is simply an area that is a square that is a mile on all sides of the square. And the population density in Louisville as of a few years ago was about 4,215 people living inside of each square mile of the city. So that's one way of measuring how many people are living in a given area. Now, unfortunately, we're not getting to do this particular part of the lesson in class. If we were, and maybe we'll have to go back and do this at a later point, I do a little experiment. You might notice the next time you walk into the room that I've actually taped off a square meter in the front of the room. And what I was going to have you guys do is have a few of you come stand inside it to show you how crowded the subways can get in various cities, which can be one indicator of population density. The craziest part is at the end when I would have had 9 of you standing inside a square meter as it is in Tokyo, Japan. That might be something we have to go back to at some point. But one important thing to say right now is to focus on that last question. How do you think that population density affects people? Well, the biggest thing is that there's a limited amount of resources in any given area. So the amount of people living there affects the access that people have to resources. If there's a limited amount of food or water, that can be a pretty big deal. It's not something that we necessarily worry about here as much, but there are areas of the world in which that's a major problem. It could also, the population density could affect how easy it is for disease to spread. It could affect any number of things. It could affect how long it takes you to get around. The more people who live in an area, the more crowded it's going to be, the more traffic there can be, the more crowded. If you go to the mall or you go to the store, these sorts of things can be more crowded as well. It can affect how crowded the schools are. So population density can affect people's lives in a lot of ways, including their access to any number of resources. Another thing that I bet you're familiar with already is time zones. I think you're very aware of the fact that if you go to other places in the world, it's not the same time as it is here, because the entire globe can't be facing the sun at the same time. On one side of the world, it's day, but on the opposite side of the world, it's the middle of the night. The United States, our country specifically, the continental U.S. has 4 time zones. We're in the Eastern time zone, but just barely. If you go just other parts of Kentucky, like Bowling Green, just an hour or hour and a half to our west, you're in the Central time zone at that point. And then we have the Mountain time zone and the Pacific Coast time zone as well. So, for example, right now it is 4:23 p.m. as I'm making this here. It would be 1:23 if you went to California, say Los Angeles. And also, Alaska and Hawaii are each in a different time zone as well. So total, the United States really has 6 time zones. Now, you're probably smart enough to figure out, if you go around the whole world, there are, of course, 24 time zones, because you're moving an hour in each one that you go into. And at one point, we talked about the fact that there's an international date line, where if you cross this line, you're actually in a completely different day than the one you're in on the other side, just because of the way that we tabulate time. But there are, time zones around the world, and obviously, if you can go to a number of different places. I think if you go to England, you're something like 5 hours ahead of us. And like I said, if you go to California, you're 3 hours behind us. So time zones are different around the world because the whole world cannot face the sun at the same time. Another thing that geographers will talk about in terms of how well a country is doing might be their literacy rate. And that's just the percentage of people, and usually it's taken as the percentage of adults who are able to read in a given country. The United States is typically around like 97, 98%. Japan actually usually reports basically 100% literacy rate. They put tremendous emphasis on education in Japan. Literacy rates are falling around the world. There's a number of reasons why, possibly. Some of it could have to do with income inequality, people simply not having access to education in certain countries, or even methods of education being used, possibly. But literacy rates, the percentage of people in a given country or any other area, it doesn't have to be a country, but it's usually taken in terms of countries, the percentage of people who are able to read. Early on in this particular lesson, I mentioned the idea of life expectancy. And that is very simply the average length of life in a given area for a given population. You can break this down in a lot of different ways. You would think with all the great medical care, the United States would rank up almost #1 in the world in terms of how long we expect our people to live. Actually, out of around 200 countries, we're only about 33rd, depending on what year you're talking about. Life expectancy here tends to be about 79, 80 years, right in that range, which breaks down to about 76 for men, 81 for women. There's a number of theories as to why that could be. Some people think that women just have better tendencies to make healthier choices over the course of their life. That could be part of it. Other factors that it could affect life expectancy, though, might be things like, access to what kind of access to what kind of medical care you can get, if you have access to medical care at all, and if so, what is the quality of that medical care? Can you afford that medical care? What does your diet consist of? Do you have access to food? And if so, we here in this country are generally fortunate enough to have access to food, but maybe we don't always make smart choices. Maybe we eat a little bit too much McDonald's and it's not as healthy. And that could be one contributing factor to why life expectancy in this country isn't as high as it could be. Now, certainly there are many countries with much lower life expectancies. Some countries where it's even only in the 30s, for example. And those countries often have high infant mortality rates, which is actually the next topic that we want to talk about. Infant mortality rate, the number of deaths among infants under the age of 1. So how per 1,000 live births, how many of those babies make it to their first birthday? That's one way we can measure the health of a country or an area as well. And we're actually only 46th in this. Roughly just over 6 out of every 1,000 babies in the United States don't make it to their first birthday, unfortunately. Now, you see some of the other countries that have much higher infant mortality rates below listed there. In Iraq, it's only almost 44 out of every 1,000. In India, it's about 30. In Uganda, it's nearly 65 out of every 1,000 live births don't make it to their first birthday, unfortunately. And a lot of the same factors, a lot of it's access to medical care, just as we talked about with life expectancy. A lot of the same factors can affect infant mortality rate as well. But the United States, again, not as high as it seems like maybe it should be on this particular statistic. Now, anytime you hear the word fertility, it's generally going to refer to ability to bear children. And fertility rate, therefore, is sort of the rate of the average number of children that a woman of childbearing years will have in her lifetime. And that number, as you can see from the chart there, has gone up and down pretty dramatically through history. And there's a number of factors related there. At previous times in history, it was something that was very beneficial to a family to have a large number of children, especially in rural areas where you have a lot of hands to help you run a family farm or whatever the case might be. In modern America, it seems that people are choosing to have smaller families now, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. It may be the cost of raising a child, could be one factor there that is leading a lot of people to choose to have smaller families. It could be the amount of time, with an increasing number of families having to depend on two incomes, both the mother and the father working. It makes it often more difficult to manage a larger family. Every family situation is different, so I don't want to generalize too much, but there are a lot of factors related to this. But fertility rate is simply the average number of children a woman of childbearing years will have over the course of her lifetime. Okay, the last two things we need to talk about, I'm going to kind of go in tandem here in these last two slides, because they go together. There are two different ways of measuring how much money a country makes. There's what we call gross national product, and there's also what we call gross domestic product. Now, let's start with gross national product. That's the total value of all goods and services produced by a country in a period of time. And that includes stuff produced outside the country. For example, if there's an American company with a factory in China, the money made by that factory would count towards the gross national product of the United States. So it's anything produced by the United States anywhere in the world. As opposed to gross domestic product, which only counts things produced inside of a country. So that's how it's different from gross national product. Gross national product, anything that, for example, the United States produces anywhere in the world. Gross domestic product only counts things that are actually produced inside the United States. And the reason that gross domestic product can often be a more useful statistic is because gross national product can be somewhat misleading. Yes, it might be an American company producing things in China, but a lot of the financial benefit of that, the wages and so on, of that product is actually affecting China more than it's affecting the United States. So gross domestic product, in a lot of cases, is a better measure of how it's affecting the actual people of the country. Now, there's a couple more things I want to say before I shut this off. One is you'll notice this chart right here, which shows gross national product around the world, and you'll notice that there are areas of the world where people live on less than $1 per day. We'll talk more in class about how sort of incredible and difficult that can be. You'll see in the United States, the average person, is going to spend or make more than $20,000 per year. So a pretty dramatic difference depending on where you are in the world. You'll also notice that this chart is talking about what we call GNP per capita. So, and you can do this with GNP or GDP. You can take them as a total number. So the gross national product or the gross domestic product of a country might be, several million or even several $billion or something like that. But if you're saying it's per capita, you're talking about per person. That's all that means. Per capita is a very fancy word for per person. So if you're going to figure out the GNP of the United States, you'd take our total GNP as a country, but then you would divide it by the number of people who are living there. So again, that's all per capita means, is per person. And that's all we needed to cover in this particular section. Make sure you do the notes that go along with it, and let me know if you have any questions.